You're live.
Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Backlash to Police Defunding.
You're
And
live.
are we live?
Yeah, you're live.
Okay, wonderful. Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Backlash. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. Defunding and
Yeah, you're live.
okay, wonderful. Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Backlash.
I think you're watching the YouTube stream as well, so you should just either mute the stream or close it.
Sorry, everybody. I don't think I realized that I had the stream open, and I created a rift in the space-time continuum just now. So apologies for doing that. It happens to me sometimes. I do possess these powers, but I don't always use them. Good afternoon and welcome to the finale of Scholar Strike 2020, a conversation called The Backlash to Police Defunding and Abolition. My name is Desmond Cole. I'm a journalist, activist, and author in Toronto, and I am very pleased to be hosting this final conversation with three guests who have a lot to say about the current state of policing in our country and where we all hope that we're going to be going. I want to thank Scholar Strike and all of the organizers who have made this two-day set of teach-ins possible. I'm going to do that very properly at the end of this event. And I also want to say to anybody who is watching us from Toronto or who may happen to be in Toronto tomorrow, the kind of real finale, the live finale of Scholar Strike tomorrow on Wednesday is going to be a Reclaim Abolition walking tour. I have the information for that, which I'm going to now put into the chat. It is going to be starting tomorrow afternoon and will include a walk around different places in downtown Toronto where people will be kind of commemorating different pieces of our history related to Black and Indigenous resistance in this city. So we really encourage you to join us for that. I'm going to share that with our wonderful producer and ask you to put that in the YouTube chat if you can. So let's move straight into the conversation with three people I'm very excited to talk to. I'm going to introduce them and then we'll begin. So I'll start with Passey. Passey, who uses they, them pronouns, is a non-binary Ukrainian Irish settler living in Treaty 1 territory. They hold a BFA honors from the University of Manitoba and a Master's of Development Practice from the University of Winnipeg. Kara has over a decade of community development experience, including program delivery, nonprofits, community organizing, participatory action research, and economic development. Also a very fire Twitter, if I may say so. And we are very happy for Kara to be joining us this afternoon from Winnipeg. How are you doing?
Got to get more ready to unmute myself. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. And honestly, very flattered that you think my Twitter's fire.
Just stay unmuted. All of us should stay unmuted for this conversation, so it's a real thing, not just a kind of one at a time interview style. The next person I am going to introduce is Kxndi. Kxndi, who uses she, they pronouns, is an artist, political scientist, an activist, somebody whose activism I was introduced to at the beginning of the pandemic, who's doing spectacular things out in Prince Edward Island and joins us from there this afternoon. Hey, King.
Hey, y'all. Thank you for having me.
It is a great pleasure. And finally, Skyler Williams. Skyler, who uses he, him pronouns, is Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River. He is a spokesperson for the 1492 Landback Lane land resistance and that is an ongoing land defense within Six Nations. Skyler, good evening.
All right, brother. Glad to be
Doing
here.
good. It's nice to see you too. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which we know, of course, is the traditional territory of many First Nations groups, including the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I want to say, in acknowledging the land that I'm on today, Treaty 13, Takaranto, Toronto, I just want to say that the spirit of this entire scholars strike has really been in large part to acknowledge the ongoing struggles, ongoing lived realities of Indigenous peoples on these territories, to acknowledge the millennia of stewardship that has led us to this place by different Indigenous peoples, to acknowledge the suffering of my own ancestors, Black people who were forced to come here and who were forced to work these lands, and to thank people who continue to protect the water, who continue to protect the land, who continue to teach us about relationships between us and these lands that we are lucky enough to inhabit. May everything that we've been doing these last couple of days and that the energy we're going to move forward be in the service of protecting the lands that we are on for future generations so that they can gather and strategize and dream the way that we're doing right now. Let's talk about the backlash to defunding and abolishing the police in this country. Just so that everybody who's watching knows who's with us this evening, I'd just like to give each of you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about where you are and what your sense is of the resistance to policing where you live. So what does the fight against policing look like from your vantage point? And I'm going to ask King to get us started.
PI, it's a small island. I think 145, 150,000 people. There's no resistance. There's no, if anything, I'm pretty sure the police budget increased. And it makes it complicated because here, you know, the police families, you know, you see them in the grocery stores. They're not that distance that in a bigger city you might have with them doesn't really exist. So even when you say a cab on your Twitter, you're seeing this guy at the store being like, I know what you said at on your Twitter. So there's this, like, I think humanizing that the community here is trying to do of policing as a career, as policing as like our peers. And so not much, even though we know that there are clear issues, the people that are impacted is the racialized community, it's poorer folks. So there's a big class divide in PEI. And so the white middle upper class does not see any issue. For them, it's like, we need the police to keep racialized folks, because also we're increasing in diversity. So it's almost like they need the police more now because diversity is increasing and poverty and mental health struggles are increasing. But we see that the police just mostly look in our directions, right? And so the resistance is coming from a small group of people who also feel like, you know, again, like the racialized community is not that big. So also the question of like, when things happen in our communities, we also don't have the tools yet to work on it. So even in our own communities, there's a resistance to police because they're like, well, who else do we go to other than the justice system or the police? So I always say on like almost everything, PEI is like 40 years behind. And even on this one, like it's slowly building. Like there's some folks I know who really understand that and are pushing towards that, but really it's not. I honestly feel like it's not even a general conversation. After BLM marches, like I think that ended like right there. Like that was maybe the first time a lot of islanders were even introduced to the concept of abolishing police. So, you know, it's really not there, even though we do see a serious problem with how the police treat racialized folks, especially in PEI. But again, it's part of what a certain group and class of people want to happen. They recognize that those problems protect their interests, right? So they work to maintain a certain status quo here because they know that our communities are not big enough and have not yet organized to the point where we can speak out and start to like really ask and push for the police to be defunded.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, and for going first. Kara, I'm glad that King mentioned the marches that were happening a couple of years ago, because it feels like we know that there was a moment in 2020 when we were having a different conversation suddenly, very quickly. And it's not the first time, obviously, that this has happened, but because of the murder of George Floyd, a lot of people felt like they had permission now to speak about this. A lot of politicians felt a pressure to respond for the first time on some of these issues. Tell us what you've been seeing since the time of George Floyd in Winnipeg.
So that's a great place to start. When I was trying to think of how to frame this conversation, that's kind of where my mind went. So that would have been in June of 2020, we had like a historic response to protest in Winnipeg when it came to Black Lives Matter. It was kind of impossible to ignore. It was huge. We also saw the police, unfortunately, responding to it by putting plainclothes officers in the crowd, putting snipers on roofs, and doing a lot of work to keep the crowd away from people who aren't involved in the protest from seeing it. So it really did evidence a need for that type of protest. And then just a week later, we saw an Indigenous man get violently apprehended by 4 police in broad daylight on Facebook. It went viral, as these things do. And the police responded by doxing people who posted about it. And so I feel like Winnipeg got very ignited to talk about this and to address these issues. But we are seeing it's difficult to keep that energy up. It's now 2022. What are we doing? There's still a lot of people doing a lot of really hard, great work. But we have seen that really big explosion of voices die off, like often happens with these types of issues. One thing that I would say, if I'm talking about where we're at today, is we are seeing more organization around the police budget and just the gross overspending by our police. I believe Winnipeg allocates the most out of their budget out of every major city in Canada. So it's pretty easy to start looking at the numbers and realizing just how big of a discrepancy we have, especially when we also have housing crises, mental health crises, need for, addiction supports and safe consumption sites. And we're not making any movement on those, but we'll make movement on things like militarizing the police, getting them some things like tanks and helicopters and things like that. So it's becoming a really common conversation to really pick apart that budget and really talk about it. And there's been a lot of really great people volunteering their own time, delegating to city council and both the police board about the discrepancies. And we do have a municipal election coming up. And I think we're going to see a real need for candidates to make definitive statements about that budget. I think there was a poll, I have a note right here, October 2020. So same year as the Black Lives Matter protest, that said that 1 in 3 Winnipeggers were ready for defunding. So whether or not we'll see that change come soon is kind of up to the powers that be. But I do think we are pushing and still keeping that conversation alive as much as we can.
Thanks very much for that. I checked while you were speaking, and indeed, the 2022 budget for the Winnipeg Police, the operating budget is 27% of all operating spending in Winnipeg this year. More than a quarter of all the spending in Winnipeg this year is going to the police force.
Yeah.
That's shocking. Skyler Williams, you have been dealing with issues of policing for a lot longer than the recent moment of BLM uprising, of George Floyd, of the kind of awakening that we saw just under 2 years ago. But I do still wonder, from your perspective, if the energy of recent times has influenced and changed in any visible way the work that you do on Six Nations and beyond.
I mean, I think the spending stuff is just absolutely wild. You know, when we did the Landback Lane, like, you know, over after a year, I think it was at $20 million they had spent. Like, it is just crazy, the numbers that they're willing to, you know, the armored personnel carriers and helicopters and the like it is just, so yeah. And this was, you know, July 19th, 2020. And so, like, right in that time, and, you know, to see again in Wet'suwet'en, you see, you know, all the attack dogs and sniper rifles, and, you know, like, to be at the front of those things at Fairy Creek, where there's just, you know, 40, 50 officers sitting in cars, trucks, all just sitting around. Like, it's wild to me, the amount of just time and money it's a bottomless pit. And so, in my experience over the last, you know, couple of years here has been, you know, if anything, it's the level of policing, the level of funding that's going into them, the gadgets and toys that they have is all going up.
Yeah, we've seen that. Part of the backlash definitely includes an increase of police budgets during a demand for reductions, and during a kind of unprecedented arguing for the waste, of course, in addition to all of the human suffering, the just waste of resources in policing. King, I want to ask, like, when there was that little bit of an upsurge, like, what was different? What did you notice in your community that was starting to happen that wasn't happening before? What kind of conversations perhaps were happening that weren't happening? Anything from public officials, any kinds of organizing that you were involved in or saw that, like, maybe wouldn't have been possible before there was so much international attention happening?
I think one of the big things was, like, more of our community had an understanding of what we had been saying, right? Like, in PI, like, Black people have been here from forever, from pre-colonization, really. But there's this narrative that we're new here. There's always this narrative that we're new here, that we don't exist here across the country, right? People don't really recognize that Blackness, as Black folks, have really been present in PEI. And so people have been saying that there's an issue, but it was not until 2020 that, like, I think PEI took a look at, like, wait, how does this, at first it was more, you know, an international, an American thing. But then there was an incident in the summer, in July, August, where a young Black man was arrested due to COVID. He was having a mental health crisis, ended up thrown in jail. And they threw away the key, kind of, until we went asking questions like, where'd this guy go? He was still in jail 2 months later, no trial, no nothing. And so at that point, I think, is when, like, I kind of had to come to terms, and the community, with local policing, that even locally we have a problem. So that year triggered a lot of conversations, not just in white spaces, but even in, like, the Black community and the racialized community, to be like, wait, what's going on? Like, how are we being impacted by this? And so it changed also our organizing, where more folks came into the fold. PEI, again, it's a very weird place. We kind of all function in silos. I think the mix of small town, rural, long winters, people really stay in their silos and tend to do work in their silos or address issues in community in their silos. But that kind of burst that. And, like, honestly, I think in 2020 is, like, when I met, like, the most Black people in PEI, the most even racialized folks in PEI. And since then, the organizing is crazy. Like, it's just, like, honestly, it gives me, like, all this, like, big feelings, because, like, finally it's like, okay, you know, like, there's some folks who have been saying, there's folks who before had taught me so much, elders who we would talk in these like silos in these small spaces, but it wasn't a bigger conversation. And now to see, I think especially on the racialized folk side, that we're able to come together and talk about this, and we're able to organize and respond to issues. We have now organizations like the Black Cultural Society really doing its thing. We have BIPOC Usher really doing its thing, right? And so we saw that uptake. And I think also white society in 2020, maybe early 2021, they were on board. But because it doesn't directly impact them, and PI is kind of a place that really just hops on trends, they kind of have fallen back. That's a group I could say, it's still not as prevalent. Like the province is not, like I think at like a municipal, federal, provincial level, like they're not really talking, our leaders are not really talking about it. If anything, I think they would be avoiding to talk about it because their primary constituents, what they look like, are not talking about it. But when they come into our spaces, there is that dialogue, but they do recognize and they say it. They're like, yeah, we don't talk about this because most of our constituents wouldn't want us to talk about this. So there is a disconnect. It's gone back to a disconnect, but I think the power is that within our own communities, we recognize that we found each other, we're building on that. And the dynamic has changed where also, if someone gets arrested very quickly, one of those two organizations are called, even by the system, right? They're the ones who are like, hey, we have this guy in here. We might need your support because we don't want to drop the ball. So something has changed, but some things have also stayed the same or went back to the same. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. It's heartwarming to hear that people are beginning to find each other in a new way. It's such a fraught reality, of course, because it had to happen because the world witnessed a lynching, essentially. And it's like George Floyd has paid a price that is incalculable for people to even be saying that they're woken up right now. But it is also, at the same time, wonderful to hear that people are using their grief and their anger and the just desire for something to turn that into organizing. Kara, I want to ask you, because we saw in April of 2020, before George Floyd was murdered, that Aisha Hudson and Jason Collins were both killed in the same couple of days of each other, in fact, in early April of 2020. And so I wonder, how those events, and then also the kind of international awakening that happened shortly afterwards, what kind of you saw in the aftermath, again, that like might not have been possible, wasn't maybe enough capacity until these events started being so internationally broadcast?
That is a very good question. So I need to track my thoughts back. I was going to jump ahead. Yeah, so when it comes to those particular events, we are seeing, those groups, particularly if I could mention Justice for Indigenous Lives is a group that came out of those situations that continues to go on today. It is a very interesting juxtaposition because I do think that Winnipeg was really keen to jump and talk about issues that are happening elsewhere. But especially when you think of like Aisha Hudson's case, Winnipeg has a really hard time looking at itself. And there's still a lot of public discourse that goes on about her case in particular, that like I'm hesitant to even describe any of it because I don't like giving it any space, but just the idea that anyone could potentially justify the police murder of a 16-year-old girl. So I do think that those events helped some folks realize we have work to do here, but it also did open up that kind of dialogue of why are we so willing to talk about police violence as if it only happens somewhere else, when it does really happen right here at home? And I think a lot of Winnipeggers still struggle at that. I'm going to say it's most likely going to be white ones that don't engage in communities outside of their own little social bubble. But we do still see a call into the inquiry of Aisha Hudson's murder. That's still an ongoing fight. And I do believe that that family has a lot of support in spite of a lot of the backlash that they've experienced just for making a stand on this case. So I hope that what's happened in the last 2 years has had a positive impact on their goals around that specific case. But it is just like a really hard thing to think about, that we still have these things to work on, and that case is an ongoing struggle that they're still not seeing justice for. And it's been, 2 years. So yeah, that's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary, and Aisha Hudson's family shared a message of solidarity with families who are demonstrating at the SIU this past weekend in Mississauga, just outside of Toronto. And it's really wonderful to see families who have been through this, again, through the worst possible circumstance of meeting, nevertheless connecting and carrying on some of the most important work that's happening in resistance. Skyler, we gathered here this evening to talk about Backlash. I feel like the resistance at Six Nations over Landback Lane has probably elicited a kind of backlash which you could be calculating for years to come. And I would just ask you to reflect on, despite so many of the incredible successes of the Landback Lane defense, what the cost has been.
Oh, that's a heavy question, Desmond. Come on, man.
I know.
Sure. I mean, being wanted and having warrants for you forever, and what a year's worth of that, and still having to be the public face to the camp was like that. You couldn't say a thing on Twitter or on Facebook or on whatever that you wanted to, because you had to think about what everything looks like. Like, how does that affect this? How does that affect everybody? And so, like, that ability to get fucking pissed off at the cops is something that you had to bury that down. And so I don't know. I mean, it's been a year and a half, and I guess I've been a little bit quiet over the last couple of months to try and kind of decompress my own self here. And so it's been a journey, let me tell you. And so it's and then all the stuff out west and all the stuff in Toronto. I was happy this year to get my charges dropped from Toronto, which is great, I guess. And even that, you get, 6 stitches in the eyebrow and a hole in my lip, and from a police baton, trying to help somebody up, and for them to drop the charges, I felt I almost felt more insulted by them dropping the charges. If you're gonna smash me in the face with a baton, you better stand behind that, But yeah, and so they, what you do with trauma, right? You put more trauma on it, and then as long as the next one is bigger than the last one doesn't seem as bad.
That's real. When I was thinking about the backlash, I couldn't help but remember that, a couple of weeks ago now, I think it is, Joe Biden, the president of the United States, actually mentioned defunding the police in his State of the Union address. Probably the first time that that's ever happened. And I noted that because you don't talk about something politically unless you're worried about it. So as much as people say that defund and abolish is fringe, it really demonstrated for me that politically, this is something that Joe Biden thinks he has to address. Now, he basically said we're going to fund the police even more to complement all of the trends that we're seeing here in Canada. But I wonder if anybody anybody can start on this question. Like, what have you seen political figures and police leaders saying in your local area as a way to push back against the momentum and the messaging that wasn't there before? Because it's drawing out politicians. I noticed they're being forced in some way, many cases, to show their ass when they didn't have to. I mean, Brenda Lucki of the RCMP saying that systemic racism doesn't exist, and then having to come out only a day later and correct herself, actually maybe it does. Like, this has only happened because someone decided to ask that question finally. So I wonder if any of you can think of examples in your local areas that are a kind of a manifestation of leadership finally, political and police leadership finally being forced to have to say something.
Yeah, let me jump on that one, I guess. Here, the police, after October 22nd, they attempted to make some arrests, and a couple of guys got hit with tasers in the back as they ran away from the scene. One guy got tasered in the back as he was running away. And the cops immediately came out with a video of like moments after that, where some of the boys ran up to the police windows and tried to break the windows out of the police car. And they had a video of that part and only clipped just that very short part of that whole story. And so the not the chief of police, I can't remember what the name of it is for our area here, but came out on Twitter and said and showed that video on his Twitter, and then it got picked up like nationally for the violent Indians attacking police.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's I remember that clip being actually posted and shared. It's not often that the police will do something like that for what they call like ongoing investigations or whatever, but they did decide to do it in that case.
And I mean, like, it kind of changes the public narrative around what that stuff looks like, right? And so, like, then you talk about whether or not a person can get a fair trial after there's this massively public outcry by the police saying, "Oh, us poor police officers, look at what the bad Indians did." Like,
yeah, most definitely. Kara or King, do you want to add into any of this?
I could, I mean, I feel like Winnipeg's been seeing a lot of this. So my thought is just where to start. I think I mentioned earlier that we had a video go viral online, and that the people got doxxed for sharing it, and took the police quite a while to respond and go, okay, we're sorry. We shouldn't have doxxed civilians. But they, of course, took their apology in stride, while also saying, but we have a duty to correct misinformation, which is, of course, no, you don't have to dox civilians to make statements about things that went on. And so, like, that was just a small example, but now we're seeing a really strong push from the police to rewrite narratives. And that's everything from they made a TikTok account to the chief of police joined Twitter and called it his new community engagement project. The police in Winnipeg have started a Substack, which contains a lot of, self-written, self-edited articles that are just complaining about how hard it is to be a cop and how hard it is to exist in a time where they're being critiqued. They complain a lot about journalists not just basically regurgitating their oppressors verbatim, because that's what they used to do until we started pressuring journalists to try harder. And now the police, publicly say that they think that the media has it out for them. So we see a lot of that going on. And it's honestly laughable at times, some of the things that they do to try to counter the narrative and change things. When it comes to politicians, we are seeing politicians make statements saying that they support defunding, although we're not seeing them really push for it in the way that they could be, or making stances the way that they could be. I think that we'll see that come out a lot with our next election. We already have a candidate who announced that he's opposed to defunding. So I would hope that we'll see some that say that they're for it, and so we can at least hash it out there. But yeah, I do think that that's something that is starting to change in the political environment in Winnipeg, as the politicians are expected to have a statement on this, whether they're for or against it, and we want to hear it, and they can't just waffle around anymore.
And that certainly is a change from previous, I think, election cycles and election years. If it holds true that politicians are actually going to be asked these questions in the coming year,
I hope so.
That does mark quite a dramatic departure. And saying that as somebody who works in the media, you know, we have not been interested in asking these kinds of questions. King, I wanted to bring you back.
Yeah. So in PEI, actually when on the phone, I Googled, well, we're on the call, I did Google it. And in 2020, there was a request to the premier from the Green Party, which is the official opposition here, to defund the police and move that money to mental health. And because 17% of PEI's budget goes to policing, but like PEI has a very low crime rate. And it's a very policed town. Like I live downtown and cars are always going up and down the road. So when there was that request, there was quite a few people who started noticing how hyper surveilled Charlottetown is. Like there's every corner, there's cameras. Like for a town that has like, I could go downtown, 3 a.m., single Black female, and the odds of something happening to me are slim to none, like within the city, but it's super policed. So people started noticing that, and there was a bit more conversation as to why, to this degree, could that money go elsewhere? So there was that conversation, but the police budget actually went up. After that request occurred, the police budget did go up. Another unique thing for PEI is that one of the most visible figures, and I think it's intentional, on the Charlottetown police force is a Black man. And so they always kind of go back to that, well, isn't this kind of counterintuitive to like supporting Black people? And he's been on the force for a long time, great person, but still a cop, you know, and that doesn't change the whole legacy of what that is. And so I think there's that also thing there where in a small town like this, where racialized folks are not as visible, he's quite visible. And so I feel like that's where the conversation often gets derailed. But no, like, other than those two instances where there was a request made to support mental health more, and PEI has a huge crisis. I think right now, 25% of our mental health ICU, 25% of the people in ICU is for mental health, right? Like for such a small town, 25%. And so when that request was made, it was clearly disregarded because the police budget went up. So there are conversations, but the actions are in the other direction, right? Like it's quite contrarian. And I think PEI also has like this issue of like being perceived as good. We want to be good people. So we'll sell whatever version to whoever wants to hear. So politicians here are great politicians. It's like, I'll tell you what you want to hear. I will tell my constituents what they want to hear. I will tell the police what they want to hear. It's a very, like, I don't know if I can curse, but it's like a mind fuck, you know? Because it's like, I know like your actions never match the conversations with, you know, it just doesn't, it doesn't transfer. So yeah, it's a pretty weird situation.
It's notable to me that you mentioned Black folks being used in the police force as kind of shields for criticism. We just learned today that former Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders, the first Black chief in our city's history, is going to run for the Progressive Conservatives of Doug Ford in the upcoming provincial election here. So salute to all the Black people out there fighting for, what was that? Oh, right, the conservative police agenda. I mean, Mark Saunders has always been part of that agenda, so it's absolutely no surprise that he would do this. But Mark Saunders was held up for years here in the era after revelations about carding as being like, well, you can't criticize us. He's Black. Look at him. But can you also mention mental health, which I think for many has been a window into larger issues about policing? There are so many different avenues where people come to like contemplate why police is not the right response, why there should be an alternate response in our communities to situations that should have nothing to do with the police. And Skyler, I want to go back to you, because another one of these issues obviously is land defense. And when there are treaty disputes between the government and Indigenous peoples about sovereign and unceded territories, the police are so quickly brought in as a measure of control and of kind of ending the conversation. You were arrested last year in unceded Wet'suwet'en territory for engaging with people defending the Yinta in that territory. And I wonder if you can talk about your experience there and about the ongoing choices of the Canadian government to solve land dispute issues using the force of the police, the RCMP.
With the heavy questions, man. Yeah, no, that was a bad one. You know, like, I know like Desmond and I know each other, you know, he's heard a story or two from a couple of spots here and there, and so like for me to say that was a bad one, that was it was you know, the initial raid was something that was, you know, assault rifles and attack dogs pulling at their chains, and you know, 100 RCMP officers filing off of buses for 8 of us standing on a bridge, you know, and you know, to be arrested and thrown in the, you know, paddy wagon or whatever and transport vehicle, carted off with I can't remember the final number. I think it was like 14 or something that was arrested on the first day. And you know, we all get to this police station. They, you know, they tell you to strip down to your base layer. I mean, it is northern BC. It's quite cold, and so everybody drops down to their long johns or their underwear, and then they tell you to keep on moving. Like, I'd like to have my pants back, is what I said, and they said no, that we had to stay in one layer, whatever your bottom layer was what you got to keep on. And so we spent the night like that. There was 3 of us in our cell, myself, Logan, and a guy from out west there, and Logan Stotts, and his sister Layla, and another girl from Kxndi. We're in Miranda was in the next cell to us, and they could at least kind of hear each other if you put your head up to the door, kind of thing. But then a funny thing happened in the morning. We got asked to go for court in the morning. We went walking out, and there was a big bag of our belongings that were sitting by the door, and I asked if I could grab my clothes and put my clothes on. And I just started reaching for it. I started putting my pants on and pulling my pants out of the bag, and the cop said, "Oh no, you got to stay in your one layer. All your stuff will be going to the courthouse with you." And so I didn't question it much, and so I got leg shackles and handcuffs on. There's an SUV in the garage, and they walk you out this door. Logan and the other cellmate were already in the back seat, and they walk us around to the back, and he opens the hatch, and inside there's these 2 what I see is dog cages. They're like, you know, like if anybody's ever seen anybody with a big dog like that, like it's like a full-size dog cage. Like it's what, I don't know, 3 feet deep, are 4 feet deep, 3 feet tall, maybe 2 feet wide, 2.5 feet wide. And it's got a stainless steel bottom on it with this little pad at the back. And I said, I'm not, and he said, all right, hop in. I said, I'm not getting in that. And then the cop starts going on about how, there's 12 other people or 13 other people that need to go before the judge today. And so if you want to hold things up here, you're more than welcome to do that. And I said, well, there's 20 other cars in the parking lot. Let's take one of those. And he said, no, this is the way we're getting to the courthouse. Take your leave or you can go back. And so I bit my tongue and crawled in the back, and then you get to the courthouse, get put in a cell there till it's our time to talk. And I remember coming out of my cell and being like, hey, can I get dressed before we go to court here? And like kind of jokingly, like I thought it was just something somebody forgot to grab my bag of stuff. I don't know. And he said, oh yeah, no, all your stuff's going to be ready for you up there when you get bail. I said, okay. And so we start walking along and thinking before I go into open court, that somebody's going to give me something besides my underwear to walk in a courtroom with my leg shackles and chained up to my wrists. Like I thought at some point here there's going to be something different is going to happen. And you just kind of shuffle along. Anybody that's been in a courtroom or jailhouse of any kind has all seen, you just it's just one nondescript door to the next, and like, then all of a sudden I'm 4 steps in and I notice that the floor has changed because you're just looking down trying not to trip over your leg shackles, and the floor changed from concrete to this red carpet, this weird dark bright red carpet. And I look up and I'm standing and there's the body of the court. It's filled. There's lawyers, there's court personnel, there's the judge, and I'm standing there in my underwear, like in shackles. And it's just one of those moments of like, screaming inside, like, how is this 2022 or 2021 at the time, ended November. And so like how is this 2021 like that this is still happening? And like in the odd thing about it is there was 3 people that were were the ones that had to go in our underwear and shackles and all the rest. And that was me, Logan Stotts, and Layla Stotts, and one unlucky white guy that got stuck in a cell with Logan and Skyler Williams, I guess. I don't know. And so we all had to go in that way, and so like picking just the Indigenous folks to do that too, like everybody else was non-native. And so it was quite the thing, a very stark reality to be made aware of in such a slap in the face kind of way. We talk about it all the time, people say these things, but when it's actually slapping you in the face in the biggest, like those big ways, like, and the same thing in Toronto, getting, targeted and smashed in the face with a baton, or down here having, hundreds and hundreds of police officers set up right directly across the road from a school. Like it is just never ending the level of violence that the state is willing to wield to, put down Indigenous resistance.
I'm so sorry that happened to you, Skyler. I've heard that story before, but you and the others paid a real price for your decision to go out there and to resist. And we appreciate you. And I want to let everybody know, we're going to put in the chat here as well, that the resistance on these territories that we're talking about in Wet'suwet'en territory, those resistance actions continue, the solidarity actions continue. They continue inviting people to go out to camp and be with them. And so I'm going to share that link in the chat with you so that you can see that and think about how to support in any way that you can. Also, for those of you who are watching us on YouTube, we want to welcome you to be able to ask questions, which my wonderful producer, Rajon Holit, is going to put to me through you. So please feel free in YouTube. You might have to refresh this page that you're watching on in order to be able to type your questions in the chat, but please feel free to do that. I'm sure many of you are participating already. I can't open it and see you because space-time continuum rift, as we experienced at the beginning of this. But I trust that you're all there watching, and we appreciate you being here. So please feel free to send your questions right now. We've got about 20 minutes left, and then I'll try to relay a few of those if there's time. Kara, let me come back to you and ask, in the midst of this up and down, of these moments where explosions happen, usually because of something awful, usually because of an unforgivable police activity, does the focus for just a short window of time in the mainstream suddenly kind of glom on to some of these wider issues and then it goes away? I just want to ask what kind of interventions you're seeing in Winnipeg that are really sustaining this work when it's quiet. So when the cameras aren't on the subject, when everybody isn't writing and tweeting about it, when the hashtags aren't flying, what kind of work do you see happening in Winnipeg that is sustaining long-term defunding and abolition work around police?
Yeah, well, first I'd love to shout out Justice for Black Lives Winnipeg, because they're amazing organizers. They're responsible for that historic rally that we have, and they are still organizing other events, other panels, education events, and I know that they also do a lot of really amazing mutual aid work. I personally do some organizing with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, which is a group that works very collaboratively with a lot of other groups, but we have found that, you know, while we try to kind of spread our approach to all sorts of things, whether it's community engagement, attending events, sharing resources, hosting our own educational events, we've seen some success with campaigns that we've run. And I would say, if I could pick 2 or 3, actually off the top of my head, would be, we have Police Free Schools Winnipeg, which is a kind of offshoot initiative of Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. That's specifically about getting the SRO program out of schools. We don't need police in schools. And that is an ongoing project. We have seen some small wins, but there are still some barriers to really finding out things like data that has been collected hasn't all been distributed publicly for people to read. But some really great work has been going on there, including being able to reach out to some parents who didn't even know that police were present in their kids' schools, and being able to organize with them and help them, you know, present to their own school boards and fight this. The other campaign would be our helicopter campaign. We have a really annoying helicopter in our city that costs an average of $5,000 a day to run. We have seen that the most common use of the helicopter, for some reason, is to respond to wellness checks, which I really don't know how a helicopter is going to help someone in a mental health crisis. But that is the most common use for our helicopter in Winnipeg. So we created a campaign to basically complain about it. Sometimes complaining is one of the best things you can rally people up to do. And we were able to start our own kind of complaints forum. We challenged the police on the ability to submit complaints, because people were reporting regular surveillance in their areas. They were reporting being followed by the helicopter. I know I live in the north end of Winnipeg, which is kind of the poorest, most high Indigenous population condensed in one neighborhood. We hear that helicopter over our house at least once a night, if not more, way more in the summer. But anyway, the police basically admitted there's no way to submit a complaint. They told us to call the airport. The airport told us to call the city, and then the city told us to call the non-emergency line. So our campaign was able to create a a system to collect these complaints. What will be done with the complaints is still yet to be seen, but at least now the police are collecting that data and they have to report on it for their next year. So that is something we were able to do and really band people together on. Most recently, we just completed a survey, which was in response to a survey done by the city of Winnipeg. And that survey was an attempt at, I guess, engaging people about police funding models, but they didn't offer any options in the survey that were defunding. They were just different types of funding, and none of them actually reduced police funding or proposed even a freeze. But in spite of that, they saw, I had a note somewhere, a response that said over 50% of people believe that the police need to be defunded, and 600 people wrote in comments about defunding the police. We also did our own community survey, and we found that 70% of respondents are interested in defunding based on our survey. So we have been able to kind of just keep creating campaigns to push these conversations forward and make sure that people are really informed about how money is being spent in their city, and yeah, just how negligent everything is when it comes to being accountable for that.
These are all like really, really tangible kinds of interventions. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's like, it's really helpful, I think. And your comment about creating surveys where defunding isn't actually an option, I've seen this happen in other cities too. And it's like, these are the kind of tactics in the backlash that we really have to be cognizant of, is that it will be presented to us as though, well, you have the option now to give feedback about policing, but of course we're controlling what options you can select. And so going around that and having people write letters and doing other campaigns is like really critically important. Kxndi, you mentioned, King, I should say, excuse me, can you mention that in your city in Charlottetown, you've noticed also that people make calls now. They know who to direct questions and try to direct support to when something happens. So I wonder if you can also talk about like specific kinds of interventions that are not always getting the headlines in Charlottetown or wider Prince Edward Island, but that you see as being like really important to keeping this momentum in these conversations happening and the work happening.
Yeah, I think a big part for here is that we have folks to bear witness and folks to be with folks. So at this point, the community knows that if something's occurring between a system, almost any system, and a racialized person, there are these organizations that will, even if they can't intervene or have, that's still intervening, right? So they could bring a spotlight onto it, but also sometimes it's, we're just going to keep showing up. We'll keep showing up. We'll keep showing up. Those are some of the interventions we've been seeing, where even now the system, like recently a Black, like, it was interesting because the call came from the prison, and the prison themselves called us and they were like, we're not really sure why this guy is in here, but he's a Black dude. So I thought that was quite surprising that like they reached out to us to be like, hey, we see a problem and we need support and we're not really sure what to do about it. It's a small town, and I think because 0 degrees of separation, news travels fast, it's created almost, I'm cringing because this word, a relationship, like I don't think it's it's like a healthy relationship, but there's a relationship where the systems and even the police recognize our existence, and we've let them know of our existence. We've supported people going through trial. We've supported, I think the situation you knew about, Javan, brought a lot of attention to it, had protests outside. A lot of the community really wrote to the politicians in the community, just being like, this isn't who we are. This isn't Charlottetown. This isn't PEI. So we're seeing almost like it could look kind of quiet because a lot of times it's those behind the scenes conversations, phone calls. It's almost like policing existing with support of racialized folks to make sure too much harm isn't caused. you know, like to kind of be like, okay, we know that you're dangerous. We know we can't abolish you yet. Can we at least be present? Can we at least be right there watching, at least watching? There's been incidents of racialized folks having mental health crises. BIPOC Usher has community navigators. They're called at the same time. So the police arrive, racialized folks arrive. And I was one of the navigators a couple of years ago. And it's terrifying because you're like, holy, I am choosing to put myself in this situation where we know how police react, but also having us there has helped diffuse things, even just to be like, you ain't got to say that, man. Like, so there's so many things. I think our presence being allowed can also like diffuse and an understanding also of being like, no, that's not, you know, like if it's in a different language, that's not an aggression. That's just someone speaking their language. That's just someone praying. You don't like to de-escalate. So I'm seeing that as a bit of a game changer for PEI, where we can be present and it doesn't, even if we don't de-escalate, we can at least bear witness where also people are not lied on, because that's another whole thing, right? Where the truth becomes misconstrued. So we can just be like, nah, fam, that's not what happened when we were there. But again, I think in a small town, it's just like this, like very, honestly, I think it's this funny spot because you also know they're armed, you know, they're here, you see them everywhere. I know they know where I live. Like, so there's this part of like, straight up moving with like fear of your oppressor, but also knowing I need to be in the room. Like some of us need to be in the room. So I think for PI, that's what it's been looking like. I know there's folks who are trying to organize, you know, conversations and on boards with the police, racialized folks who are trying to work with them from inside. I don't really know what that one looks like. And I know there's conversations with like, again, with the province, it's ongoing. There's data collection. I think that's another thing where like both organizations are now collecting data. So for every incident, it's documented what happened, who was involved, which isn't something we had before. It was often just stories that you heard from individuals. So there's like, I guess in my head before they look like small things, but now as I say it, I'm like, oh, those are actually quite solid, quite solid. Yeah, those are some of the things going on in PI right now.
Yeah, I'm glad you're realizing that as you're saying it, because this is exactly why we wanted to have this conversation. We have received a couple of questions in the chat, one of which is a question that we get almost every time we have a conversation like this, which is, what can allies of the struggle do? And I am going to answer this question on behalf of the panel and say, listen to what the panelists are saying and then try to engage in it where you live. There is no magic answer that anyone here is going to give you. People here are talking about intervening and witnessing when the police are doing harm in their communities. They're talking about letter writing campaigns about police equipment. They're talking about physically showing up to demonstrations that are happening. Not all of these things are for everybody, but there's a role for everyone to play, and you don't have to put on the ally hat and then ask for a special task. We are all doing this work together for our collective liberation. There is another question that was asked that I've been handed, which is an excellent one. It is in reaction to the recent blockades, and that meaning the blockades in Ottawa, at the Coutts border crossing in Alberta, at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario has now announced that blockades at international borders are now illegal. They have some proposed rules and legislation around this. The questioner says, I believe they're spending millions for cop training as well, and wonders if the panelists have thoughts on this. Skyler, you have participated in your share of blockades. And so, yes, the province moving to say that we can now declare these kinds of obstructions illegal on top of the criminal code law that already exists. What's your reaction to that?
You know, it's hard because, you know, you see Indigenous people making these, but like those roads that we're blocking, like those crisscross our lands. Those borders that you drew across these, like they crisscross our lands. Every bit of infrastructure that you have crisscross our lands that, like, by your own admission, was stolen. You know, like, but like, and it's an absolutely ridiculous thought that you are going to further criminalize Indigenous folks or anybody that comes with them for blockading anything on lands that we like. Those are our lands. And so like that, like it is an absolute ridiculous thought to me that this is like dumb.
And for people who are listening and saying, what can I do? Well, I think you can contact your provincial member of provincial parliament. There is an election coming in less than 3 months from now. We are going to the polls in Ontario. Make this an issue if anybody shows up at your door, if anybody asks you for your vote and for your support. And even if they don't come and ask you, you can write to your representatives and you can say, we don't need this in Ontario. The Emergencies Act that was invoked federally was one of the biggest overreaches of government that, you know, we've seen in some time, just in terms of legislation that's been sitting there and has never been used before, and was used in a situation where it really wasn't needed. And people warned that, hey, there are going to be echoes of this. They're going to bring in restrictions that are going to stay with us after the convoy is over. And this is a perfect example of one of those now trying to become sticky in our legislation. So I think it's really important that we push back against these things and that we use our time gathered together to talk about them and to think about them. We have just a few minutes remaining. And so before I close Scholar Strike 2022 officially, I want to give each of you a chance to say anything you'd like to in the last few minutes that we have here about your hopes for a police-free future. That is what we are all collectively fighting for. And Skyler's laughing. Don't laugh, or I'm going to make you first again. But you know, we always have to be able to project beyond the reality that we're living in, a reality that is sometimes really bleak and hard to keep fighting within. And the only way, and I used to think when people would say like imagining futures and all this stuff, I was like, what are you talking about? But then I realized the level of despair that I carry every day doing this work, not knowing what the future is going to be. So let's spend a couple of minutes each projecting what our hopes could be for a future without police as we bring things to a close here. Kara, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, fun. Okay. I mean, I feel that in the organizing work that I do, the main goal is to defund the police and refund the community. And so my vision of what the future would be, you know, more social housing, affordable housing, more addiction supports, the existence of safe consumption sites in Winnipeg. We know that they're super, super needed. We know that our shelter system is failing people. We know that every winter we see the exact same issue with homeless folks being left behind, freezing on the streets of Winnipeg. I would like to imagine a future where that doesn't exist anymore. And I think that can be accomplished by defunding the police. On top of that, I would love to see a queer community that is open to talking about police and their presence within mainstream queerness, because that's something that I do not see movement on in Winnipeg. You know, we know that a lot of queer rights were based in police abolition and fighting back against police brutality. But now that we have a lot more people holding a lot more privilege in these positions that represent queerness to the mainstream, like pride organizations, we are seeing that it's just impossible to get the police out of there, that they won't even talk about it. In Winnipeg, we saw our local pride ban a trans performer because they made anti-police statements on Twitter. And so I would really love to imagine, if I'm ever going to be happy being part of Winnipeg Pride and that community, I'd love to imagine a future where the police aren't present there and they're not a thing that we have to talk about. because we know that it affects our safety. So that's the future that I'm, I guess I would imagine.
Really valuable thoughts. Thank you. Thank you so very much. Skyler, I'll go back to you.
You know what? And part of the reason I laughed was like, it's just been in the last little bit to like start imagining again. Like it was very much a crisis bit after crisis after crisis after crisis over the last couple of years here. And so it's been in this last couple of months that like been able to get some focus and see, past what's like, right in front of my face kind of thing. And so like it's been nice to dream. It's been really nice to be able to dream. And and part of that is absolutely is abolishing the police. Like it is without us being able to have a discussion about land ownership without having any kind of fear of what's going to come down, like what's going to come down. And because like I don't think that's anything more than Indigenous people across country have been having, was just wanting to have like a frank, honest discussion with whoever, and like show us how you bought this land legally, like show us where Six Nations got, like we're open to that discussion. Like let's have that without that conversation being at the point of a barrel of a gun, and like that's something that I think we're seeing over and over and over again. And like I can, there are moments when you can see that future is possible to have those conversations without there being guns present, to be able to have there be some like real dialogue. And so I'm hopeful. You caught me on a hopeful moment.
I picked the right day.
This is it.
When you have a smile on your face, I feel happy too. So it's nice to see it sometimes. King, you're going to get the last word at Scholar Strike 2022. What are your hopes and projections and dreams for a police-free future?
Oh, wow. I'm known to be a bit utopian. So I completely believe this can happen. I actually believe we could eliminate racism in my lifetime, but I checked myself on that one. I think also one of the things I really hope to see is people really understanding, because even like when I started to get into like my pre-colonial history, that's when I realized that policing is quite a recent Western phenomenon. Like we were able to live without policing. And so it's not just looking to the future, it's also we can look into the past and be like, this hasn't been who we've always been. We've been able to hold each other accountable and take care of each other without being violent, without mass murder, without, and people weren't doing crazy things, that's the part where it's like, wait, like how did our ancestors survive without police that carried guns, right? How did our ancestors survive without like mass incarceration? We've done it before, right? And so it's like, can we remodel some of those things into present day? Maybe not all of it can translate, but like some of it could. And that's one of the things that I hope more people get into pre-colonial history and be like, wait, our story did not start 300-400 years ago. There's a lot of history before that did not look like this. And the other thing too, I hope people watch, and I know this is crazy and I'm pushing like a franchise, but even Batman, because I feel like the villains in Batman to me really speak to, we created the Riddler. And we see that a lot of the crime is a circumstance of mental health, of poverty, of class, of oppression. So it's like, okay, if we can address all those other things, will we have crime? That's the part where I'm like, I think crime would, like, we know that crime would really go down. So that's the other part, is to be like, when people are like, oh, well, we need the police. No, we need better communities. We need healthier communities. We need kinder politicians. We need kinder communities. We need elder support. We need to study our pre-colonial history. We need to also dream, right? Like, but blend all of that, dream, make art, and have these conversations. Because we have a lot of the tools. I think it's just that people don't have access to them. So I believe we'll see a time, at least in some communities. And I think that's the part where sometimes I look at PEI in a bit of like a utopian way, because it is a small population. And even here, if say like we decided to do a test run and be like, all right, maybe we can't do it across Canada, but we'll do it with this small population and see how that plays out. Then we'll do it with this bigger population and see how that plays out. I tend to be quite on the hopeful side, and so I really do see it. I hope that in our lifetime we'll get to see a world that we care for each other instead of want to criminalize each other.
I hope that too. And I know that the three of you are going to continue working towards that, not just dreaming and projecting, but taking risks, building alliances, and educating the way that you've done here this afternoon and evening. King, Kara, Sky, thank you so, so, so much for doing this. I appreciate all of you.
Thank you for
Done,
having
guys.
us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Aaron, Skyler.
And I have some more thank yous as we close the 2 days of the teach-ins. I want to say thank you to all who organized, who participated, and who followed and watched these 2 days of teach-ins organized by Scholar Strike Canada. We want to thank those of you who endorsed the labor action, who funded and supported it with your labor and your amazing feedback. Thank you to all those who provided ASL closed caption and support. Thank you to all of the students, to all those who ran technical support, to those who did some of the logistics to make sure that people were in communication for some of these teach-ins and conversations. We appreciate all of your efforts, and we could not have done this without you. Thank you to Min Suk Lee of Scholar Strike for hosting the opening of the SCC labor action on Monday, and for her overall support of the labor action. Thank you very, very much to Bev Bain of Scholar Strike Canada and Kristen Boss, who were the two conveners of this labor action. We want to thank Mick Wagwan and Chris Boss for organizing the demonstration that's going to happen tomorrow, which is Reclaim Abolition Tour. We've provided a link in the chat for you if you want to come and join the Abolition Tour. It's going to be taking place tomorrow in Toronto, starting at 12 p.m. at Gould and Bond, which is just east of Yonge Street, right around Ryerson campus. So we have the Day of Action link again posted for all of you if you'd like to and are free to come and join us tomorrow. So my name is Desmond Cole. I want to thank Rajan, who has, as far as I know, been glued to a screen for the last 2 days, producing a great deal of what you've seen. And for everybody on the technical side, everybody behind the scenes who actually made this broadcast possible, thank you. We really appreciate you. Thank you to all the organizers. We'll see you tomorrow, hopefully some of you. And more generally speaking, I hope to see all of you in the streets and in friendly community places before not too long. Good evening, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.